The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Timmy? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the wind show remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Welcome to the Spanish Arpada. I'm Sarah.
And I am Peter.
In this series, Joel Rey, we are ranking and reviewing all of the rulers of Spain from Leovigild to Felipe VI. Join us as we learn about each ruler and then rank them in the categories of conquistadores.
I'm guessing this involves violence.
No me digas. Let's think about how that went.
Yeah,
Ortodoxia.
Oh, he was off his parents, I'm sure.
El resto. And then decide whether they deserve to sign the fuero with their signature, Yo el Rey, or whether we tell them fuera.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster and this is Season 5. Our topic is Vulgar History Internationale, Scandaliciousness Without Borders, Tits Out, Sans Frontières. And this is another episode inspired by a suggestion from a Tits Out Brigade member, Alicia, or maybe Alicia. I want to thank her for bringing this story to my attention, and I have to say, in a very attention-grabbing way, and this is why I suggest if you're going to be offering names of people you think would be good subjects, you really want to just succinctly explain to me why they're cool. And Alicia just basically said, I think you should do Inês de Castro, the zombie queen of Portugal, and I was like, I'm sorry, the zombie queen of Portugal, and I was in, and that's what we're doing. Spoiler. Zombie Queen of Portugal. So we're looking at Inês de Castro after Alicia brought her to my attention. And also thank you to Alicia for answering some questions about Portuguese culture and helping me with figuring out things like the significance of Inês. So my other sources include an episode of the Stuff You Missed in History Class podcast, Wikipedia, theroyalarticles.com, and also dailyartmagazine.com. So as part of our Internationale season, the story takes us to some places we've been before, but not in a time period that we talked about before in this podcast. So this is Portugal, and also some parts take place in the Kingdom of Castile, both of which are in the north/middle of what is modern-day Spain. Sorry, Portugal is not in Spain. The Kingdom of Portugal is basically where Portugal is now. It was just a bit bigger then. Castile is in the north-middle of modern-day Spain. And this is in the 14th century, so which is like 100 years before Isabel of Portugal was trapped in her ghost castle from that previous episode. So these are all new royal people to learn about in this era. So the Iberian Peninsula, which is what we would now see on a map as Spain and Portugal, just kind of like that big square shape sticking off of Western Europe, was divided into several kingdoms. From west to east, these kingdoms were Portugal, which is where modern-day Portugal is, but I think bigger then, Galicia, Leon, Castile, which you've heard of before, and Aragon, which you've also heard of before. As per usual, they each had their own king, always a king, I think, never queen. And so these little kingdoms had various alliances and feuds. Everyone was related to everyone through marriage, for alliance reasons and stuff. But anyway, little kingdoms, always at war with each other. This is way before Isabella and Ferdinand came along and consolidated it all. This week's heroine is Inês de Castro-Nez Perez de Castro, who I'm going to call Inês de Castro because that is how she is best known. She was born in Galicia, I assume. I mean, probably because her father was a Galician nobleman and his name was. And I mean, my Portuguese accent is non-existent, but your girl's giving it her best here. Her father was Pedro Fernandez de Castro, one of 3 people, I think, potentially 4 people in the story named Pedro. But he's not in it after this paragraph, so don't worry about it. Papa Pedro was descended in an illegitimate way from the kings of Castile, Leon, and Galicia. And this is a situation where even if you're the illegitimate son of a king, you still get lots of power and prestige. But he was not himself a king or a prince. He had a wife named Isabel Ponce de Leon. Was she related to the explorer? I mean, everyone's related to everyone, so probably. That is not who Inês's mother was. Inês's mother was Papa Pedro's mistress, who was a Portuguese noblewoman named Aldonza Lourenço de Valadares. So she had several siblings, some full siblings, some half siblings, who included a sister, Juana de Castro, and 2 brothers, Alvaro and Fernando, who are going to become important later on. So just pin that for later on. So Inês was born in 1320, again, about 100 years before Isabel of Portugal and the Ghost Castle. In terms of other people who've talked about on this podcast, 1320 was very close to the same time that Joanna of Naples was born. As per ever, who knows what her childhood was like, because I can never find out that information about anyone for this podcast, but we do know that when she was about 20 years old or so, she was sent from Galicia to Portugal to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her cousin. I'm not exactly sure how they're cousins, but all the nobles in the whole Iberian Peninsula were all related somehow, and her cousin was Constanza Manuel of Villena. Villena? A note on Constanza, who's kind of like an important secondary character in the story. So Constanza was basically the same age as Inês. As a child, she'd been married to her cousin, not Inês, another cousin. Again, just everyone's related. Anyway, Constanza had been put in a child marriage to a person who would later become King Alfonso the 11th of Castile. But he was not yet the king. He was, I guess, the prince or the infante. But so they were married for just 2 years, and then Alfonso had the marriage dissolved so he could marry Maria of Portugal, who gave him a son, Pedro of Castile. This is the second Pedro in the story, P2. And it wasn't very straightforward to just like get rid of Constanza, like divorce, not an option. I think they must have had the marriage annulled. Anyway, or he tried to. Constanza was trapped in a tower. Mark that off on your bingo card. In Toro. So he just kind of was like, I don't want to be married to Constanza anymore. I'm just going to lock her in a tower and marry Maria, I guess. But she had a good dad. There are one of at least 2 good dads in this story. Constanza's father waged war against Alfonso for years for doing this, for ending the marriage and for trapping her in a tower. Eventually, Alfonso and Constanza's dad reached a peaceful understanding after mediation, and Constanza was released from prison. I don't have the year written down, but she's probably like, 17 at this point. But remember Alfonso, dirtbag, he married Maria of Portugal. Anyway, so Maria of Portugal's dad, another good dad, learned that Alfonso was treating Maria badly, and because Maria was from Portugal, this meant that the government of Portugal was now mad at the government of Castile because Alfonso was just fucking everything up. Ultimately, this led to Portugal making a deal, like the government of Portugal making a deal with Constanza's father. All of this led to Constanza's second marriage. Again, she is a teenager. And her marriage is to Pedro, the heir to the throne of Portugal. And this is the main Pedro. We're just going to call him Pedro. The other Pedros, there's Papa Pedro, there's P2. This is the main Pedro. And this is the wedding that kicks everything off. So Constanza, aged about 20, is being married to Pedro, similar age. And Constanza's cousin, Inês, was sent to be one of Constanza's ladies in waiting. So the chessboard is all set up. Because apparently from the first time their eyes met, Inês and Pedro of Portugal fell instantly and passionately in love. Apparently he was drawn to her heron-like neck, which is a very poetic thing. Who knows what she was drawn to? Maybe he had nice eyebrows. I don't know. But bear in mind, she came to town to be lady in waiting to Constanza, her cousin, who is marrying Pedro. But Pedro was drawn immediately to Inês. She was his one true love, but for political reasons, he knew he had to marry Constanza. So I really feel badly for Constanza in terms of like just bad luck, 2 husbands in a row. And even after they were married, Pedro apparently neglected her in order to focus all of his attention on Inês. So there is a legend claiming that Pedro used to send love letters to Inês through a pipe that carried water from like one building to another building. So like romantically, I don't know, letter in a bottle type situation that would kind of go along the plumbing from one building to another. But that is probably not true because the building they say he was sending it to, like these are 2 buildings connected by plumbing, but Inês wasn't staying in that place. But here's the thing. So this story is wildly popular and has been for centuries amongst Portuguese literature. So some of the most beautiful pages of Portuguese literature have turned this love letter in a bottle going through. Let's see. So allegedly, the 2 buildings that are connected are the Quinta de Pombal and the Monastery of Santa Clara a Velha. And so the Monastery of Santa Clara a Velha has become the backdrop of a lot of the stories, the retellings of the saga of Pedro and Inês, because that property used to supply water through an aqueduct that connected the royal palace and the monastery. So like if you're going to send love letters in bottles, that this building would have to be involved. Later on, this building comes up as well because, spoiler, eventually Inês is going to die, and allegedly the water in the aqueduct turned red after her death. But she's not dead for a long time now. And so it's just kind of this awkward love triangle between cousins. So Constanza gave birth to a daughter named Maria, and then she gave birth to the first son, who she named Luis. And then in a cunning maneuver, which I respect, aimed at trying to end her husband's love affair, Constanza invited Inês to be the godmother of the newborn son. What's cunning about that is that, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, which is the church they were a part of, a godmother is considered a member of the family. So if Inês is considered a member of the family, then that would render her affair with Pablo incestuous, and then they would have to stop, Constanza thought. But this whole scheme, which I respect, did not come to much because baby Luis died after a few weeks, and that's super sad for everybody, obviously. Meanwhile, so this has been going on for, I think, 4 years. Pedro and Inês, wildly in love, potentially sending letters through aqueducts. This was not good for business, like the family business of Pedro, which was trying to avoid war between Portugal and all the nearby kingdoms. So Pedro's father tried to separate them, which he did. His attempt was he banished Inês from court to go off and live in Castile. But guess what? Distance could not stop their passion, and Pedro just pieced out of Portugal to go visit her as often as he could. Meanwhile, Constanza, who I really truly feel bad for in this situation because she never asked for this situation to be in, she was in failing health. She gave birth to another son named Fernando and then died 2 months later. So I don't think it was like a death in childbirth scenario as much as it was like giving birth put a strain on her body and she was already ill. Anyway, Constanza, R.I.P. You deserve better out of literally everyone in your life, except maybe her dad, who seemed like an okay person. But with her dead, now we can all just like ship Inês and Pedro without feeling bad about it because he's not married anymore. So Pedro and Inês also pretty psyched about this development because he was no longer married. So he got Inês, brought her back to Portugal, and they moved in together in Coimbra, which is a riverfront city in central Portugal, where they lived in the Palace Santa Clara a Velha, the one from before, where people with the aqueduct. So like Inês didn't live in there before, but now they live there together as a little happy family. They didn't get married, or did they? We'll return to that point later. They were just kind of living together, seemingly. Pedro's father kept trying to arrange a new marriage for Pedro to a noblewoman or a princess from another kingdom because that was like the job of the heir to the throne, is to like make alliances through marriage. But Pedro refused to take a wife who wasn't Inês. And he was not given permission to marry Inês because as a non-royal, she was not deemed eligible to be queen. So, married or not, these two settled into a domestic situation in which Inês had 4 children. Afonso, who died in infancy, Beatriz, João, and Dinis. When they were hanging out together, Pedro became close to Inês's brothers, the De Castro brothers, remember? Alvaro and Fernando. And the brothers, just seems like, it's like Pedro is getting like an outside opinion after having lived at court for a while, and Inês's brothers, potentially Inês herself was involved as well. They tried to convince him to try and claim the throne of Castile, which Pedro technically could do because he was the grandson of Sancho IV of Castile, who I believe Inês was also descended from in some way, but everyone is related. Like, don't worry about it. Pedro was like, you know what, great idea. I think I will try and usurp the throne of Castile. But the thing is, of course, if he tried to do this, that would damage the already fragile relations between Portugal and literally everywhere else. But Pedro was like, you know what, I'm going to do it. And he declared his intentions to take over Castile and Leon, which were like a combined kingdom. The king of Castile and Leon at this point is, of course, someone else called Pedro. And in fact, it is P2. So it's Pedro of Castile, who is the son of Constanza's first husband. Remember, he was terrible, with Maria of Portugal, the woman he left Constanza for. So P2 is the king of Castile and Leon. So Pedro's dad was not into the whole taking over Castile scenario, and in fact, he thought that this was yet more evidence that Inês and her brothers had too much influence on Pedro. He also worried that Inês and her brothers might try and insert her children into the line of succession for the throne of Portugal, replacing Constanza's legitimate children. So remember, Constanza had 2 surviving children, one of whom was Fernando, the boy who'd been born 2 months before she died. But both of her children, had health issues and were apparently sickly. Remember, Constanza had been sickly as well, so maybe they like inherited something from her, or maybe the fact that she'd been sick when she was pregnant. Anyway, Fernando was heir to the throne, but he was sickly. But Inês and Pedro's children were all apparently healthier, so that might be used, Pedro's dad thought, as an excuse to try and get Inês and Pedro's children to become the heirs to the throne instead of Fernando. But also Pedro's dad was like, it wouldn't be hard to kill little Fernando because he's so sick already. And he was worried that Inês's brothers might like literally try to kill Fernando, which after the dita of it all from last week, it's like, you know what? Little baby princes and kings like get murdered in these stories. So it's a clear risk. So Pedro's dad was worried that little baby Fernando is going to be killed by the de Castros. Basically, all the Portuguese nobles were worried about the consequences of Inês's brothers and Inês, like what was their influence over Pedro, because everything seemed kind of headed towards civil war. And Pedro refused to marry someone other than Inês, which was not helping matters out, because like if he had married someone from another kingdom, then that would have maybe made people less likely to go to civil war. But so what happened is that Pedro's dad and his advisors were becoming desperate to find a way to, quote, liberate Pedro from Inês and her brother's influence. And not a very creative group. What they thought of was, let's just murder Inês. So initially, Pedro's dad was reluctant to agree to such an extreme action against the mother of his grandchildren. Like, thank you. But January 7th, 1355, Pedro was away on a business trip. His dad called the counselors into a meeting, and at the end, he finally agreed to send 3 of his courtiers, so people named Pero Coelho, Alvaro Gonçalves, and Diego López Pacheco, to Coimbra, to the castle with the aqueducts, in order to kill Inês. And I think King Dad came along too. I think he was there. I think they all went together. So anyway, so they arrived, and Inês appeared surrounded by her 4 children, and she appealed to the king, who was there. Yeah, so the king was there. She appealed to the king, and he was just like, ooh, do I want to kill like my son's beloved and the mother of my 4 grandchildren who are so cute and right there? Finally, the king left the room, saying to the others, do whatever you want. And as soon as he had turned his back, the sentence was carried out. Inês de Castro was executed. And so this took place in the estate of Santa Clara of Velha, where they had been living together since the death, and the place from the story of the aqueducts. But a myth would develop that associates Inês's death with another place called the Quinta das Lágrimas, the estate of tears, where people believe her blood still stains the red stone bed of the spring on this estate, where she is said to have cried out for the last time while being pierced by the daggers of her killers. And then the whole thing about the water ran red, etc. Like, you might be like, and this is like 20 minutes into an episode and the main character is already dead, but you forgot, Zombie Queen of Portugal. The story continues. So Inês may be technically dead, but her story is far from over. So one account suggests that Pedro, remember he was on a business trip when this all happened, had gotten a heads up about the murder, but he thought it was a lie and didn't believe it. So did he get a heads up before? I don't know. But regardless, when he learned that Inês had actually been killed, the terrible news drove him into a fury, obviously. So knowing that his father had ordered the killing / been there, Pedro staged a revolt against the king / his dad. For several months, with the support of Inês's brothers, troops swept through the country and laid siege to the city of Porto. Finally, it all ended when his mom, Queen Beatriz, intervened to end the revolt and bring about a reconciliation between father and son. And Pedro formally promised to forgive the incident. I feel like Queen Beatriz, what mediation skills? Like, how on earth would you have gotten this to happen? Good job. So Pedro pardoned the men who had killed Inês, and everything settled down on the royal family for 2 years. But 2 years later, King Dad died, Pedro became the king, and guess what? Pedro didn't mean it when he said he forgave them, because he was ready for vengeance. So As soon as he was crowned, and in spite of his promises of forgiveness, Pedro did a trade, sort of like a prisoner exchange with Castile, because he found out 2 of the assassins, Pero Coelho and Alvaro Gonçalves, had been living in Castile. And so he was like, I'll trade some prisoners from Portugal if you give me those 2 guys. And Castile agreed. The 3rd assassin, Diego Lopez Pacheco, had fled to Aragon, and Pedro was not able to secure his return, but he had 2 of the 3 killers. Pero and Alvaro were both subjected to torture, then were gruesomely executed in a way that paralleled how Pedro felt when Inês had been killed, which is he had their hearts ripped out. So from one, the heart was cut out and ripped out of the body through his back, and from the other, the heart was cut out and pulled through the chest. So Pedro is just like, this is how I felt when Inês died. Like, my heart was ripped out of my chest. So guess what? Ripping your heart out of your chest. Which honestly is like, if you don't have a partner who would do that, if you were murdered, then like, are you in a good relationship is the question I would pose to all of you. So all this happened in front of the royal palace. Pedro watched this all while having dinner, which is like a pretty distressing yet iconic thing to do. So this event is why Pedro became known as Pedro the Cruel. But here's the thing. So there were 3 King Pedros in this era at this time. There's our Pedro, there's P2, and then also the King of Aragon was, guess what, also called Pedro. So it's like, was our guy Pedro the Cruel? Like, because each of these 3 have at some point were written about by somebody as Pedro the Cruel. So were writers just confusing them all? Like, is this what happens when everyone is cousins and they're all called Pedro? I don't know. Does just somehow the name Pedro the Cruel in Portuguese rhyme or something? Anyway, so Pedro, aka Pedro the Cruel. But other than this one thing, this one like pretty brutal thing, it sounds like our Pedro's entire reign was evidence of his benevolent character. So he's also sometimes called Pedro the Just. So like, okay. But story's still not finished. So in 1360, Pedro publicly announced that actually he and Inês had been secretly sexually married 2 years after Constanza died. And everyone's like, wait, we thought you were just like living together. Like, that's the whole thing, because he couldn't marry her because she couldn't be the queen. And Pedro's like, haha, but we were secret sexy married. And I have witnesses. So a bishop and one of the bishop's servants were presented as witnesses of the wedding, although nobody seemed to remember the date when it had happened. This announcement was backed up by a totally not forged document from the Pope showing that Pedro had gotten consent from the Pope to remarry. And everyone was like, okay, I guess Inês retroactively was your wife, which makes her a person who has been dead for 5 years, our queen. So our queen is now a dead person? Yes. So this is how, again, 5 years after her death, Inês de Castro was declared Pedro's legitimate wife and therefore the Queen of Portugal. This was, as you might assume, the only time a dead person was crowned Queen of Portugal. But also, and probably one of the reasons Pedro had done this was this legitimized their 3 surviving children, because the secret marriage, the alleged marriage, had happened before the children were born. So now they were no longer illegitimate, they were legitimate children. But now that Inês was the zombie queen, she was permitted to have a much grander final resting place than what she'd been first given. And so Pedro ordered her body to be exhumed and taken to the monastery of Santa Clara in Coimbra, taken from the monastery of Santa Clara in Coimbra to the monastery of Alcobaça, where Inês was reinterred in an extraordinary ceremony on April 2nd, 1361. Chronicler Fernão Lopes described it, and I'm just going to read what he wrote because it's a beautiful piece of writing. Pedro ordered a tomb of white marble, finely surmounted by her crown statue, as if she was a queen, and then he caused the tomb to be placed in the monastery of Alcobaça, and made the corpse come from the monastery of Santa Clara of Coimbra, escorted by many horses and noblemen and maids and clergymen. And all the way through, 1,000 men were holding candles in such a way that always the body was enlightened, and thus it arrived at the monastery, which was 17,000 leagues away from Coimbra, where the body was buried with many religious services and great solemnity, and it was the most magnificent translation ever seen in Portugal. The extraordinary splendor of this ceremony was so impressive that A person who wrote A History of Portugal in 1893 described the scene with the metaphor, Inês de Castro was led to Alcobaça between two lines of stars. And I mean, that's the kind of love we all deserve. Like someone who's going to rip out the hearts of your killers and get 1,000 candle-holding guards to escort your grave 17,000 leagues. Like, this is why I'm strongly considering giving Pedro the Lady Jane Seymour Outstanding Supporting Performance Award, because all the heroines of every episode deserves this sort of treatment. The tomb itself is gorgeous. I will 100% post a picture of it on Instagram and maybe also on the website, just so you can truly, or just like Google it, like Inês de Castro tomb. It is gorgeous. So my best attempt to describe it. Pedro made sure that Inés's royal title, Queen, was visible on the tomb, and then ordered that his tomb be laid next to her so they could be facing each other, or sort of across from her, so they could be next to each other for all of eternity. The tomb itself, it's like a lying down statue. So it's carved out of limestone from Coimbra. So it's like a lying down Inés is like lying on top of this like big limestone thing. Surrounding her statue, like her personage, are 6 little angels who are sort of taking care of the creases of the royal clothes and raising her head a little bit as though to make her like eternal slumber more comfortable. Her statue has a serene face. Let's see. The tomb itself is supported by 6 hybrid beings that have human faces and animal bodies. On the like sides of sort of the bottom of it, it's like a big box with like her lying on top. And so the big box part on the bottom depicts in carving scenes of the life of Jesus Christ. So one of the scenes is the final judgment. There's a belief that with this last scene, Pedro wanted to show that he and Inés had a place in heaven, unlike the people who did them wrong, like his father and her killers. On the bottom left of the like box part, we can see the dead who resurrect and go out of their graves. God is at the top center watching over everything. It is a really beautiful piece of art, and no one knows who carved it, but it's very spectacular. So, Zombie Queen. There is one long-standing myth/legend that prior to being reburied, Pedro had the corpse of Inés placed on the throne, put the royal crown on her skull because she had been dead for 5 years, and forced the entire court to swear allegiance to the dead queen by kissing the hand of the corpse. This is most likely a legend/myth because the first time it was ever written in was in a play from 200 years after all of this happened. Like, nobody contemporaneously talked about it, and the whole beauty of the like interment parade, the 1,000 stars, like I don't think they would pause, like pop out her body, do this, and then put it back in. But I mean, what a story. So Pedro lived on for another 6 years after all of this until he was assassinated. He was succeeded by his son Fernando, which was the little sick boy whose mother was Constanza. And no, the story's still going on. Don't worry about it. So Pedro, like, he had his tomb already, I would imagine, under work. So his tomb is placed opposite of that of Inés, and they were not put side by side, as you might imagine, but they were across from each other, so that because their belief was that the day of the last judgment, all the dead come back to life, and he wanted, when the dead come back to life, that they would both get up and like sit up, you know, and like they'd be across from each other and they'd be able to see each other right away. His tomb is equally stunning as hers. Again, I'll post the pictures on Instagram or just like literally Google it. It's like Pedro lying there on top of like a big box, little angels helping make him more comfortable. This is not just like describing art podcast. I'll get to it. There's like, okay. So the same thing, like the sides of the box part on the bottom show like Jesus Christ in his life, etc. So there are also 3 concentric wheels carved into it. So the bigger one, called the Wheel of Life, has 12 petals and shows episodes from Pedro and Inés's life together. The second one, the Wheel of Fortune, only has 6 petals. and its images are interpreted to symbolize the purity of love between them, and the immortality and resurrection they will eventually achieve. So the Wheel of Life shows the following moments. Like, this is what's carved into his tomb. So Inês cuddling their children, the couple with their kids, Inês and Pedro playing chess, the couple spending time together, Inês watching someone on the floor, Pedro seated on a big throne, Inês caught by her killers, Inês unveiling the face of one of her killers, Inês's assassination, Inês lying dead, the punishment of one of Inês's killers, King Pedro wrapped in a shroud. And then the Wheel of Fortune shows the following moments. Inês seated on Pedro's left side, which indicates they were not married. Inês seated on Pedro's right side, which shows now they're married. The couple side by side looking like they're posing for an official portrait. King Dad expelling Inês from the kingdom. Inês repelling King Dad. King Pedro and Queen Inês lying on the floor. So the foot of the tomb is all about death. Well, there's also some carvings on there showing elements of the life of Saint Bartholomew, who's known as the patron saint of stutterers. And apparently, Pedro had a stutter. Did not know. And so the words in Portuguese, até o fim do mundo, are carved onto the tomb, which means until the end of the world. So a tribute to his love for her. But we're still not done with the story. So to understand the full effect of this love story and the significance of Pedro and Inês, we need to keep going. So, Pedro and Constanza's son, Fernando, reigned for 16 years. He and his wife, Leonor Teles, had one surviving child, a daughter named Beatriz of Portugal. Without a son, it effectively meant that whoever married Beatriz would kind of be the new king of Portugal. So like all the princes from all the kingdoms wanted to marry her, including, interestingly, princes from England and France. Eventually, they chose to marry Beatriz to King Juan I of Castile because that would ease tensions between Portugal and Castile, which had been pretty shitty for a while, obviously, because, well, I guess non-obviously, like, it had been shitty during Pedro's era, but then since then, Fernando had waged 3 wars against Castile. So this marriage was intended to put an end to hostilities with a union of the 2 crowns, but it was not a widely accepted solution because Portugal was represented in this marriage by Beatriz, and Castile was represented by Juan, a man, and because of the like way that gender relations worked and dynasties and things, it kind of meant that like Castile would become more important and Portugal would be kind of like subsumed by Castile. Lots of nobles were fiercely opposed to that possibility, but they could not decide who they preferred to be the new king instead. There were 2 potential alternate kings of Portugal. Like they wanted to just like get rid of Fernando, replace him with a new king. The 2 potential replacement kings were both sons of our Pedro. One of them was João Castro, who is Pedro's son with Inês. The other was also named João, so like we've moved from a Pedro era to a João era, and this was João of Avis. And he was a son that Pedro had 2 years after Inês's death. He had a son with a Galician peasant woman named Teresa Gile Lorenzo. So, in terms of Pedro getting the Lady Jane Memorial Outstanding Supporting Performance Award, like he did so much to just love and honor Inês, even long after she was dead. And then I'm like, ooh, but he had a child with someone else. But I'm like, you know what? That's fine. Like Inês was dead. He took comfort in the arms of someone else. That person had a son. I don't think that discounts Pedro. Although I do prefer in handing out this award that the people who get it never waver in their love of the main heroine. But we'll talk about this after. Anyway, so there's 2 potential new kings of Portugal, both sons of Pedro, both called João. And this all kind of took off because King Fernando, who is the brother of both Joaos, half-brother, died. And then, let's see, so he died, and then his wife, Queen Leonor, assumed regency in the name of Beatriz and Juan because they had not had a child yet. And as per ever, a whole succession crisis happened. This is like not dissimilar to what happened with Dida and all of the who's going to be king situations and that. Anyway, big succession happened, and over the next 2 years, it was Joao versus Juan. A big turning point, one of many, was when the bubonic plague struck the Castilian forces, forcing Juan of Castile to retreat. And so he kind of was out of the running. So then it was just Joao versus Joao, Pedro's son versus Pedro's son. But then evidence came out, maybe forged, that quote unquote proved that the letter that said like Pedro and Inez were totally married, don't worry about it. Someone was like, ooh, that letter was maybe a forgery, which meant that Joao Castro, Inez's son, was not legitimate. Like his kind of edge in this battle against the other Joao was that he was the legitimate son of Pedro, but if he's illegitimate, then he and Joao of Aviz are more on the same level as each other, so that was a blow to him. Joao of Aviz got some support from England. England agreed to help. They won a big battle, and eventually Joao of Aviz was proclaimed King of Portugal. So fun fact though, so this English/Portuguese alliance would be renewed with the Treaty of Windsor. So this treaty, this is the treaty that they signed, and it's still valid today, which established a pact of mutual support between Portugal and England. In fact, Portugal would use it again in 1640. They got England's help to expel the Spanish Habsburg kings from the country. Again, during the Peninsular War, this England-Portuguese alliance would also be used by Britain, like when England became part of Britain, in World War II, which allowed the Allied forces to establish bases on the Azores, and then during the 1982 Falklands War. So that is an old treaty that just kept being used. I know what you're thinking, what about Inez? And here's the thing. Her legacy would go on in a very major way. So the thing is, Inez and Pedro's son, Joao, did not become King of Portugal, but their lineage did continue on, just not as king. So their daughter, also called Beatriz, that's like the third Beatriz in the story, married Sancho Alfonso. And their daughter, Leonor of Albuquerque, married Fernando I of Aragon. And their son was Juan II of Aragon, who married Juana Enriquez. I promise this is going to get a point. And their son was Ferdinand of Aragon, aka Ferdinand from Ferdinand and Isabella. So Inez and Pedro's line leads to Ferdinand from Isabella and Ferdinand. So that means that Ferdinand and Isabella's children, Juana of Castile, Catherine of Aragon, were descendants of Inez and Pedro, which means that Philip II and his descendants were also Inez's descendants, which means the next several centuries of monarchs in Western Europe were all descendants of Pedro and Inez because everyone kept marrying their cousins, etc. But wait, there's more. So the national commotion and the aura that was created around these events, like the Pedro and Inez story, even at the time, it was a big deal. Everyone was just loving this love story. It immediately became, a story that people told each other. This could not go unnoticed, not just by people in Portugal, but all over the place. The first known literary treatment, a chronicle written about this love story, dates from the 14th century, so just 100 years later. It was written by a Jewish writer, David Ben Yom Tov Ibn Bilia. And since then, the story has inspired a diversity of approaches comparable only to the story of Romeo and Juliet. Inez's memory has been celebrated everywhere in epic and lyric poetry, novels, dramas, paintings, and music. More than 120 operas were created about this story in Italy alone. It's been made into a play, a musical, ballet, opera, so in all different countries. But obviously in Portugal, the story achieved its greatest artistic and literary recognition. So medieval royal chroniclers wrote about it. There's a long tradition of literary works down the centuries. The story continues to inspire almost all of the most renowned Portuguese writers. And if you're like, this should be a movie, oh, it's been a movie. So the first movie was in 1910. There was a silent movie. Then there was also a movie in 1944, 1997, a 2005 TV miniseries. And then most recently, there was a 2018 movie released internationally under the title The Dead Queen. The Portuguese title is Dom Pedro e Inês. And that movie is based on the novel by Rosa Lobato da Faria. So there is a saying in Portuguese. I did check with Alicia, who has helped me with some Portuguese cultural stuff in this story, to ask, like, have you heard people say this? And she hadn't really, and she asked her parents and they hadn't really, but let's bring the saying back. I don't know. So there's a saying in Portuguese. It is too late. Inês is dead is a saying. Anyway, it's too late. Inês is dead. So anyway, the story, this is the thing. So like literally like the zombie queen, the like crowning a skeleton probably didn't happen, but the way that her life, so like her life after death has just been in literature and plays and culture and just like this love story. And also, and a lot of that's because of how Pedro commemorated her, like these beautiful tombs, which you can still see. I believe the place where they are is like a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Like Pedro made sure nobody forgot about her. And no one has. So this is the story of Inês de Castro. We'll look at scoring for her. Actually, first, the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance. I am going to give this to Pedro. So, because, yes, although he did have a child with another woman, he also like hunted down and ripped up the hearts of Inés's killers. He also like had the most beautiful funeral procession in world history. He also made these gorgeous tombs. He made sure she was never forgotten. Just some of the potential scheminess he did, being like, oh, we were actually secretly married, so our children are actually legitimate. Don't worry about it. Like Pedro, I appreciate how he loved her so clearly. But we're scoring just Inês herself, not the story, not her and him. And in terms of scandaliciousness, I feel like there's not that much really, because, I mean, okay, so she's a lady in waiting. She went to court. She became his mistress, which is like, ooh la. But like, that happened a lot, frankly. Like, this just got more interesting because in a sort of Anne Boleyn-like way, like Pedro loved her more than men were expected to love their mistresses, which I guess is scandaliciousness, like his monogamy. But Inês herself, like she showed up, she was amazing, he loved her. I'm comfortable giving this, I don't know, like they had a little domestic life. Like she was murdered, but she did not murder anybody. She herself did not do scandalous things really, other than just like be with Pedro. I'm going to give her a 5 for scandaliciousness. Inés's scheminess. Now, I don't know what she did versus what her brothers did. We have to kind of put them together because otherwise I don't know anything about her. So it was her and her brothers were encouraging him to like take over Castile, etc., which is pretty schemy, but were they sending letters and aqueducts? You know, but that was Pedro. Like, I feel like her scheminess, like this is a great saga, but I don't have high hopes for Inês herself, you know, getting a iconic score here, which is fair. That like she achieved other things other than getting a high scandalicious score in the Fredigan Memorial Scandaliciousness scale. Inés's scheminess, I'm gonna give her a 6 because maybe she was involved in the stuff her brothers are doing. Significance. This is where I just like I couldn't figure this out myself. So I asked Alicia, who knows about Portugal, is from Portugal, and she said probably like a 7 or an 8 based on Inés's sort of cultural importance. So I'm going to trust on that and just give her a straight up 8 for significance because of everything I just said about her importance as like a muse to literature and stuff. And then also because of who her descendants became, like Ferdinand and Isabella, you know, that was because of her. Sexism bonus. So it was kind of like it's a classist thing, like the fact that she wasn't allowed to marry Pedro more so than a sexism thing. But then where they were like, how can we stop these brothers from scheming against Pedro? I know it's by killing her. It's like, why would that stop the brothers? Like, so they really blamed her for what Pedro was doing, which is inherently a sexist, shitty thing to do. She was, in fact, murdered. So I think in terms of sexism bonus, I'm going to give her a 7, I think. And so what does this all add up to? That's a 26. So where does that put her? There's a number of very respectable people with a 26. including Frances Howard, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, Anne Askew, Lady Anne Stanley, Margaret of Anjou. So certainly a respectable score here for Inês de Castro. What a saga, honestly. So yeah, all that's left is just to remind you of a couple things. So if you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's links to all the stuff there. You can listen to past episodes and Instagram or at vulgarhistorypod. And if you go to vulgarhistory.store, vulgarhistory.store, you can look for our merch. And you can always use code TITSOUT for free US shipping, or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. And if you want to get more of my storytelling, you can support me on Patreon. So go to patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter, and that's where I post for Patreons every month. So this asshole, the episode's about horrible men of history. Also, that's where you can find the Vulgar Piece Theater, discussions with me, Lana Wood Johnson, and Alison Epstein about costume dramas. I would love, if I can find a way to get it in Canada, for us to watch The Dead Queen, the movie about Inês de Castro. But as of right now, not available where I live in Canada. You can also follow us on Twitter at Vulgar History. And yeah, our international tour of Scandaliciousness continues on next week with another super scandalicious story. And I hope you're all doing okay. And keep your mask on, keep your tits out, and I'll talk to you all next time.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.